Okay, it's hard to match that introduction, huh? Geez, go to a beach and hang out for a while. Good to see you all again. As some of you may know, I haven't been here for a while. I was in Australia doing work, as it turns out. It's really hot in Australia right now. So it's nice to come back to not just Los Angeles, but to this classroom, one of my favorite places to be. And I was working for the Australian government for about a week on a couples project. And the project was a nationwide initiative to encourage more people to participate in relationship interventions of all different kinds. And I was asked to contribute and assist in the evaluation of this program for the government. And the government set aside $20 million for people who could tap into this fund and then spend that with any kind of relationship education or therapy kind of experience. And my study, the study I was involved in was designed to determine how many people did that and how they differed from other people in the country. So it looks at that, with the concern being that if you go to a group of people and say, guess what, here's a lot of money, that the people who don't need the money are the ones who end up spending it, right? And that's the risk. As it turns out, our data seem to indicate that it's quite the opposite, that when you do make those money available, that people who are actually in need of the services are more likely to avail themselves to them. So you'll hear more about these sorts of issues when we get into our Chapter 12 material, the information about couples interventions and how to get people to use them more. But it was a very exciting project and very interesting to be part of it. So we're at a very important point in the course now, as you know. Right before the midterm, we talked about, we finally got to the essential part of intimate relationships, the joining forces, the connecting forces, the things that we do when we're with one another that make us feel glad to be with one another, that make us contribute and participate in the deeper emotional sorts of experiences of being in a relationship, maintaining a relationship. Immediately after the midterm, we stayed within the interpersonal domain. And so you heard two guest lectures, not about joining forces, but about divisive forces in relationships, about interactional events that push people apart. Conflict, aggression, hostility, frustration over being unable to resolve difficulties. So we're now moving to what I think of as a deeper understanding of interpersonal processes in relationships. And we now see that understanding how we communicate in relationships really requires an appreciation of how we understand and interpret what our partner is saying. There's an interpretational cognitive perspective, a cognitive dimension to our interactional dynamics in our relationships that really transforms those dynamics. Now, this idea that how we think about the world, how you and I construe all kinds of events in our daily lives matters, is an old idea. Goes back very far in some classic writing. So in Enchiridion, this guy on the top right, Epictetus, wrote that people are disturbed not by things, but by the view they take of them. And the next time you're in an argument with your partner, you might want to say that. Like, this isn't, you're just getting disturbed by your interpretation. I'm behaving properly here. Shakespeare, you might remember, said that, for there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so, right? The events that happen in our lives aren't events that come with a built-in interpretation, but it's something that we add. It's an interpretational, cognitive imposition of our beliefs and ideas and our values on these behaviors. And John Milton, 1667, said in a very similar way, the mind is its own place and in itself can make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. So the idea is that while there can be an objective reality, and while people like me may really try to go into people's lives and videotape them and try to understand how they are communicating and where their communication is going off track, you and I can all watch those videotapes. What we can't see is what's going on inside people's heads that change how that communication is unfolding, right? And that is where we are in the class. How do we get inside people's heads, and how do we add a level of complexity to our interpersonal dynamics that gives us a deeper understanding, not just of how they work, but how any of us can really approach our relationships in a healthier and more productive way. Neil Jacobson, who you heard about when we talked about social learning theory, 1981, classic reference in the field, said that the fact that two spouses living in the same environment perceive such different worlds suggests that in functional terms, spouses are operating in vastly different environments. Right? So we think about our intimate relationships as these interdependent associations, right? Remember that from our first and second lectures. It's this interdependence, this back and forth exchange, in this idea that two people sort of form a unit all by themselves, separate from other units in the world, right? And now we're saying, actually, even though it looks like they're coordinated with one another, there's a behavioral exchange and behavioral synchrony that defines and characterizes all of our relationships, still inside our heads there are very active, very dynamic processes happening that lead us, even though we're physically very close, we can be cognitively in very different places. Here's a man on the left running with his dog named Spot. Here's his girlfriend who he hasn't seen in weeks and weeks and weeks, and he wants nothing but to see Jane, but Jane clearly has a different perspective on what's going to go on in this immediate exchange, right? Here's another example. This is why we will never understand each other. That's what it says there on the left side. The next panel says what he heard, which was, honey, why don't you put your head in a vice and I'll turn the handle until your skull explodes. But what she actually said was, honey, why don't we turn off the TV and just talk, right? So somehow, and we saw this in the Frank and Nadine video right after the midterm, somehow the words that follow from my partner's mouth aren't the words that actually reach my brain, right? There's a filter in there, and we have to understand those filters. So let's sort of dig in and get a little bit more sophisticated on this. Because behaviors and events can be ambiguous, we're all making meaning all of the time. Lots of times this is scripted, right? So we're sort of going down existing channels. We're using meaning-making processes that are comfortable and familiar to us. But still, we're engaging in cognitive processes that give meaning and predictability to the world that we're participating in. When we interpret something, that usually means that we link something really specific, like, why did you leave the toilet seat up? Like, is this just an act of disrespect? Or is it just that you left the toilet seat up, right? So there is a global meaning, and it's the globalness of the meaning that is often very powerful, right? Because when your partner does something nice for you, you don't want to just say, oh, you've done something nice for me. You want to say, this conveys something more about you and us and our relationship, right? So you move from this specific event, your partner reaches over to hold your hand. You want to say, oh, this isn't just a nice thing, it signifies something more global and more inclusive, right? And conversely, when something negative happens, you don't want that to interfere with your global judgment, right? But if you say, oh, when you didn't hold my hand, oh, by the way, here's a true story of a friend of mine. He had just gotten off the altar with his wife, and they were in the receiving line, and he reached over to hold her hand, and she did not hold his hand. And you can then say, what's up with that? Was her hand just too warm? Was she sort of going to reach out to hug somebody else? Or was that a bigger signal that there was a problem up ahead? Turned out to be the latter, sadly. But that's the idea, right? Is that a specific thing gets extended up to some global meaning system. And that's what we're doing all the time in our relationship, and we have some choice over how that happens, as I say right here. And those choices matter because our emotions and our actions are often guided by the meanings that we infer, right? So we sort of register an event, think about that in broader terms of meaning, bigger concepts, and then our emotions follow from that, right? We have an emotional experience on the basis of that inference. So let me show a clip from the story of us. There's a lot of swearing in this clip. Might shock you to know. This movie is so old that Bruce Willis had hair. That's how old this is. But let's take a look. What I want you to see, this is a movie called The Story of Us. And it's about a failing marriage and a couple's attempt to repair that marriage and ultimately a successful attempt to do that. But in the middle of it, they have a very big argument. And what I want you to do, even though this lecture is about cognition, what will jump out at you is all the words that Michelle Pfeiffer and Bruce Willis are saying. Like, you'll hear the words, but what I'm going to do is try to look for the meaning behind the words that we hear. How is it? And the key thing is there's going to be massive, rapid escalation of anger here, right? And what is the meaning? We can look at the behaviors, and they extract meaning from that, and they get very tense emotionally. Okay, so we want to sort of unravel that process as a way of cluing in on the power of these perceptions. In the span of 90 seconds, 120 seconds, this event, this loving event of writing a letter to their kids, escalates dramatically, right? And again, the idea is you get this really specific sort of exchange, but within this exchange, there's ambiguity, right? There's ambiguity over the meanings that are possible. So what does it mean that my wife doesn't want to make love to me right this minute? Oh, it means she's rigid and over-controlling. Or it could mean she's the greatest mom in the world, how lucky can I be? Right? So there's ambiguity all the time in our conversations. Usually we pick pro-relationship sorts of interpretations so things go smoothly. But there are these ruptures, there's these breaches in our conversation where because of this ambiguity, what we might think of as a maladaptive sort of interpretation lands and registers, partly driven by our emotional experiences, feeling like we're going to be rejected, feeling like we've been rejected in the past. And these old ghosts come in, right? So earlier in the story, we see how he's flirting with his secretary, and that's a big problem. But the idea is the walls around these strong negative emotions start to come down, and they all spill over. And then you end up 2 minutes later with a conversation that really doesn't make much sense. It totally didn't get them anywhere. It wasn't productive in any way, and could have ended up in such a different place. Oops, I forgot to switch that. So we have to wonder that if this is, yeah, question?
Yeah, one question. So why exactly do we do maladaptive interpretations? Like, why couldn't he just be like, oh, well, she's a great mother, she's writing letters to her?
Yeah, why don't we go to the more positive avenue? What do people think? Why don't we, yeah?
I think a big part of it is we're just confirming what we already have observed throughout our relationships.
We're confirming what we already believe to be true. Yeah, okay. We're in some ways trying to justify our own feelings in the same way. Yeah. We're protecting ourselves. Right? It's not by mistake that they were defending their own points of view. And at one point, Michelle Pfeiffer says, "Not for 1 second have you tried to see it from my point of view." Right? This is all through your perspective. His response, you might remember, was, "Yeah, and that's you choose to see it this way. This is a choice you're making about how you want to perceive me," when in fact that's sort of unfair fighting. Okay, so what determines which meaning is imposed? And psychologists say these are motivated processes. That's sort of an important idea here. And it gets us at Gullness's exact point, which is why would we do that? If we love our partners, something quirky, something strange must happen that say, oh, actually, I'm going to end up flipping over the mattress and swearing at you. That'll be a good solution. Well, where do those meanings come from? Where does all that affect come from? And as we just heard, we have to also recognize that there's a history here, right? So it doesn't just start anew in a relationship. It's sort of rides along with a lot of prior experiences in the relationship, and that often comes out. But the idea is there's motives. We're motivated to act in certain ways. And when we're searching for meaning, we're motivated to see the world in particular ways. So our cognitive processes have some agendas, right? They operate in the service of fulfilling certain needs and goals. And as I'll say in a minute, there are three main motives that people pay attention to. One is enhancement. And by the way, they don't always work together in the same way. You'll see that they're sort of competing with each other at different times. And there's an enhancement motive that I'll tell you about. There's an accuracy motive that I'll tell you about. And there is a justification motive. So let's start right in with the first of these. When we're cognizing our world and our relationship, our intimate world, we do spend a lot of time enhancing what we've already got. So one of our motives, one of the great things about being in a relationship, especially is being in a relationship with someone who does this, right? So enhancement is wanting to be confident in our relationships and just have everything be pretty chill. You just want it to go along well. Not a big deal. It's things go smoothly. We get along well. We share our feelings. We deal with problems when we come up, mostly because I think you're pretty great and you think I'm pretty great. And isn't it better for us to see the world that way? So that's what the enhancement bias does. And we want to pursue and generate and find information that supports and strengthens positive beliefs about our partner and about our relationship. That's an enhancement bias, right? And if any of you have been in relationships, if any of you are in relationships right now, especially to the extent that they feel pretty fantastic, you're enhancing a lot. And that's a great thing. By the way, we just had Valentine's Day. Did anybody get engaged? Not yet. Okay, it's coming up. Did anybody do something pretty fantastic with their partner? That you want to talk about? I think you did great things with your partner that you don't want me asking you about, is what I think. All right. Chances are you are enhancing each other a lot. And I can only hope that the lights were low and the music was perfect as you are mutually enhancing one another. Data show that we view our partners more favorably than they do. So when your partner says, when I say about myself, I'm a reasonably good, reasonably productive, reasonably even-tempered person, when the enhancement bias is operating, our partners think even more highly of us. Our partners think highly, often to justify being with us. We also we view our partners more favorably than they do, and more favorably than even their friends do, right? So there's something special about the way that we view our partner, even relative to their friends. Okay, we sort of see our partner with a bit of a glow around them when we're in a good stage in our relationship, and even a typical stage of our relationship. And we view our relationships more favorably than when we view other people's relationships. So when you are in a relationship and walking around campus and see other people holding hands who are in relationships, you say, I bet they have a great relationship, but I bet mine's just a little bit better. A second motive is knowing and being known. So whereas enhancement is a kind of a bias, sort of shading things in a way that is more positive than other people might perceive them to be, accuracy is saying, actually, I can't be fooled here. I can't be deceived. And we want to think well of our partners. That's the enhancement bias. We want our partners to think well of us. But at the same time, we have to be paying attention. We have to be protecting ourselves and making sure that we're not going to be exploited. So we need accurate information, and that allows us to predict and control what's going to happen in our relationships. And there are times when accurate information is highly desirable. So if you are about to move to a more serious and committed stage in your relationship, you're going to really want to know if some of the things your partner has told you are actually true, right? So part of what we're doing is protecting ourselves from exploitation and really making sure that we are going to be making the right decision when it comes to the partner that we want to be with and the relationship that we're going to have. When threats come up in relationships, often that instigates a search for accuracy, right? So if it seems like your partner is spending a little too much time with another potential mate, you want to say, is that going to go the wrong way? Should I be jealous here, or am I being immature? I really should let my partner have, the space they need to have that sort of friendship with another person. Maybe I should check that other person's Facebook status, though, just to be sure, right? Like, I need some information here in order to make a smart decision, because I don't want to be the stupid one here. I don't want to have someone walk all over me. I don't want to be the doormat. And maybe if that's happened to you before, you want to be especially vigilant to be capturing accurate information. So that's the accuracy bias, really different from the enhancement bias. And now you can start to see what I was saying earlier, which is that these things don't always work together at the same time. They achieve different sorts of goals and agendas. So this is a newspaper column that appeared in the LA Times a few years back in a column called the Ann Landers column, which people write in, and then Ann Landers solves your problem for you. And here is the person who only signed themselves as ? Says, "Dear Ann, my husband and I have been married 7 years. He's good looking, highly intelligent, we get along fine. The problem is we used to have sex about 5 times a week. In the last several months it's been once a week, maybe. I have a hunch he's having an affair." So there it is, right? Here's the data. Going to go from the data to a global meaning. Here's what it means. And guess what? That is not an affectively neutral inference, right? So this is what you got. The data, the raw data, the inference, and then the emotion that gets attached to it. I have no evidence. No blonde hairs on his coat, no lipstick on his shirt, no phone numbers in his wallet, no unexplained expenditures of money, and he hasn't bought himself any fancy new shirts. So it sounds like a bias. Like, here's the data. Could have lots of interpretations springing off of it. And this person has chosen one of them with no evidence. Okay? Don't suggest counseling. He's a psychologist. He specializes in marital problems. He's in good health, and he's very cheerful. Now that cheerfulness starts to look a little suspicious, doesn't it? Any suggestions? Well, it could just be the 7-year itch. Or he might just be slowing down. Don't be accusatory. Keep the lines of communication open and turn on the heat. Okay? So she's saying there's other options here. Don't just go down that avenue. And she's saying, I need accurate information. I've been pursuing accurate information to solve this problem. A friend of mine in graduate school was suspicious that her boyfriend, another friend of mine, was screwing around with another woman. And she, and I'll call her Ann because that's her name, Ann devised a survey that sounded very official, and she called only one person with this survey, and this was my friend's ex-girlfriend, who Ann assumed he was screwing around with. So she came up with this very elaborate script and this series of questions that sounded very official, and said she was from a local university, and ended by saying, we just have a few last questions. And I forget the exact questions, but they were things like, have you been in a relationship with anybody of the opposite sex in the last year? Yes, sir. As a matter of fact, I have. Yes, I have. And Did you break off that relationship, yes or no? As a matter of fact, I have. I did break off that relationship. And since breaking off that relationship, have you had any sort of sexual encounter with your ex-partner? As a matter of fact, I have. And that spelled the end of the relationship for my friend. So people seek out, people seek out accurate information when threats arise or when suspicions arise. The problem, of course, is that sometimes our suspicions are wrong. And then you end up really in those kinds of conversations where my friend could have said, "What do you mean you did this? Don't you trust me? I thought we trusted one another. I thought our relationship was built on more than this." And in that case, it wasn't. So there's a third motive for how this meaning process gets sort of generated, how the meaning gets generated. And this is, they're all important. This one is especially easy to identify. We look out for our relationships and we're motivated to protect our interests. It's amazing how much this is true. We certainly saw it in the Bruce Willis-Michelle Pfeiffer interaction. They were staking out territory and really, instead of saying, okay, how can we work this out so that we write a letter to the kids and that we have sex? Like, that's not a hard problem to solve, people. Like, they should have been able to figure that out. And instead it was immediately, oh no, I want what I want and I don't want what you want. And she said the same thing. I want what I want first and I don't want what you want first. Okay, that's it. The simplest discussion in the world, but what pushes us apart is this idea that your goals are your goals and my goals are my goals, and I can't wrap my head around your goal, right? It's really hard. I must be right in this position. I have to be getting the upper hand in this conversation. So it's especially true when we perceive that the relationship was not going well, as was the case for that couple. And if there's a problem, who's the cause of that problem? Well, it's not me. It's not me. And there's two people in this relationship, and it's not me, so it must be you. Hey, that solves the whole problem. Now I've figured it out. How convenient that it always ends up that way. Basic aspects of how we perceive the world support this justification motive. For example, there's a well-known self-serving bias that leads us to perceive our own behavior in ways that are way more flattering than the ways we perceive other people's behavior, right? So we are, when someone's driving behind us on the freeway, honking the horn at us, it's because he's like a total asshole, right? It's like he's just an asshole. But when someone is in front of us, slowed down, and we're honking the horn, the guy's an inconsiderate jerk, right? So somehow, even though it's the exact same situation, we depict our own behaviors in a much more flattering light. It's what we do all the time. And when we do it in relationships and we sort of tussle with our partner over who's right, usually that's a conversation where you want to say, okay, let's take a step back. Is there a way that we can both be right? How can we both be right? Or how can what I need not be quite so important? There's a lot to be said from selflessness. There's a point at which you want to not get walked on. But in our relationships, there's a lot of room for compromise. And we tend to underutilize that in moments where we need to utilize it the most. So here's a cartoon that actually came out just earlier this year. And it's a guy, you can see him reading a book, and he says, "Hey, honey, wake up. It says here I was right about that thing I said." It's a justification motive. And here's what pisses us all out about the justification motive. It doesn't, first, he's waking her up, right? Come on, you never wake up somebody who's sleeping. And it's what doesn't matter is what he said. He didn't say, oh, it turns out that Tasmania is that little island and it's just south of Australia. I just wanted you to know that because it's an important fact. What he wants her to know is, I was right, you were wrong, right? That is a powerful experience in relationships. And by the way, no one likes to be wrong. So much less being woken up to be told you're wrong. Okay, here's another example of someone saying, everything around me is chaos and confusion and bad, but me, I'm sort of perfect and I cannot be blamed for anything. Here's Nancy, the employee with serial personal problems, and she says, guess what? I'm in love with a medical school cadaver. And the other person says, do you ever think that maybe your personal problems are caused by your own bad decisions? How is it my fault that my boyfriend is acting so cold? Like, it just could not be my problem. I don't know how this can be my problem. We have a very powerful tendency to be right, and now let's connect this a little bit to our relationships. Oh, let me ask a more specific question. How does this help our relationships? How do we sort of think about this? How does all this motivated reasoning, how does this motivated reasoning actually come into play in our relationships? Well, the first thing that happens is that we want to keep negative information out of awareness, right? So the enhancement bias sort of says everything's okay. It keeps things going well. To preserve a positive view of the relationship and to promote our positive interactions, we're selective in deciding what information to focus on in our relationships, right? So we're always making choices. Believe it or not, it's hard to imagine. But we're always making choices about what, in the statement that our partner makes, what we decide to respond to, right? Sometimes we respond to their tone of voice and we ignore the content of what they're saying. Sometimes they say something really, really nice to us, and then they end with a little criticism at the end, and we respond to the criticism instead of the very nice thing, right? So all of the time in our relationships, we're focusing on different parts of what our partner says and does. And we call that selective attention. It's attention that allows us to focus on, usually, hopefully, the good stuff instead of flipping that around where we only focus on the bad stuff, right? There's also a memory bias. And it turns out we can do studies that help us to understand that we remember different things about our relationship. And our current feelings often change the way we recall the past in our relationship. So if you've ever sort of evolved from being in a great relationship to being in a relationship that it doesn't feel so great anymore, you start to say, oh, now I start to see all those moments where we didn't get along so well, right? You kind of recast the relationship in terms of the negative things that you must have missed while they were happening, right? In fact, they may well have happened, but you were very able to override them. You were able to see them in a more positive light. And this you might remember from the staircase model. Now we're starting to go down the other part of the staircase, right? Now these are some of the processes that we engage in our heads that say, we're starting to differentiate ourselves from one another, and we really might go separate ways. So our current feelings often change the way we recall past events in a relationship, especially because we prefer to maintain consistency between the way we're feeling now and what we believe happened in the past, right? So if things are going well in your relationship, you don't want to spend a lot of time saying, gee, I guess it'd be fun to think about all the bad things that have happened in our relationship, right? We try to keep consistency between our current affective state and the memories of the events that we've been experiencing in the past. So the first thing that our motives do for us is keep the negative stuff away, just sort of gives us a protective buffer. So here's a guy who's engaging in selective attention, right? Powerful thing, good thing to do in our relationships. And his wife has just gone to Costco and got this very large jar of mayonnaise. And he says, yeah, you're totally right. That's a really good price for mayonnaise, right? Where I would say, we don't have room in the garage for a car, much less mayonnaise. Take back the mayonnaise, right? He's saying, damn, that is a good price. That is a good price for mayonnaise. And that is one less argument that this guy has to deal with in his life. So here is an example of Ben Carney, the guest lecture you heard last week. Here's a study he did with his student Nancy Fry, published in 2002. This is sort of an amazing study. What he did was On the up and down axis, the vertical axis, that's how happy people are in their relationships. And this is time on the x-axis. Okay, so this is 8 waves of satisfaction data. For that is wives on the upper left and husbands on the bottom right. Okay. Now you'll notice that in each of those 2 panels, so wives up here, husbands down here. Not that that matters actually. You've got 2 lines. Okay. One of them is called a retrospective line, and one of them is called a prospective line. Prospective means as it happens as time is proceeding forward, right? In a forward way. And that's the circles. So that's the top line in both graphs. And this is a phenomenon that you already know, which is that on average, relationship satisfaction declines with time. Okay? Got that? So that's the top line. As time passes, our relationships lose a little bit of their luster. We talked a lot about that in the chapter 7 lecture, remember? What Professor Carney did is at time 8, he then said, tell me about how you relate. Draw a graph for me depicting how your relationship has gone over these last 4 years. That's a 4-year span of time, right? So prospective as time goes, and it dwindles downhill. On average, relationships are getting worse. But then you ask somebody, right now at time 8, think back about your relationship and draw a graph for me. Draw a graph for me about how your relationship's going. And what people do, you can see, starting at about the 4th or 5th wave, they say, it's actually getting better. Even though the reality is your relationship is getting worse, people say, it's actually getting better. Isn't that amazing? Why do you think people do that? Why do you think we do that on average? It's part of that enhancement bias, yeah. Yeah.
That we want to look at our relationships more favorably than they actually in reality are.
Yeah, right? So we want to say, I'm still here. I must be here for a reason. The reason couldn't be that I can't find a more attractive partner, because that would reflect badly on me. I don't want any of that. It must not be that bad a relationship. Interesting. What's that?
That's a good thing, I'd imagine.
I think it is a good thing, because when that dam breaks, then you have to go to therapy, right? Then you have to say, oh, there's a problem. Like, oh, there's something bad here. I think this is absolutely a good thing. But what's interesting is that even though the relationship on average is losing some of its luster, we say it's getting better. And what would it mean if you said the opposite? What would it say is, yep, it's going to shit. Yeah, it started off okay. I mean, it was good at the beginning, but now it's just, it's okay. Why don't we say that? People don't say that, but why don't we say that? What do you think? What are we avoiding by saying that? Yeah. Yeah, it forces us to do something, right? Which is, okay, so what are you doing in a bad relationship? Or it forces you to say, I'm not doing enough to make this relationship as good as it could be, right? So we protect ourselves. This is another example of how we protect ourselves in our relationship. We say, actually, it's pretty good. But then what happens is it can, because it actually is declining over time, it may reach a point where it's not going very well at all. And then all of a sudden, have you ever been in one of those relationships where all of a sudden it really gets bad? Has anybody had that experience where yesterday we just had a great night of sex, and today we're talking about ending the relationship? Oh, that's one of these biases working, right? I was going along, believing everything was great, kept putting stuff under the carpet, ignored her birthday, ignored Valentine's Day. It's a problem. And it rears its ugly head. So the first line of defense is keeping all that stuff out of awareness. We want to keep the negativity away from us. Just don't let that get attached to your relationship. The second line of defense is Once you can no longer ignore the negative information, manage it well. Okay? That's the second thing that you want to do. All right, okay, you forgot my birthday, or the gift you got me was, something that my mother wouldn't wear. So how do I make sense of this now? Like, how do I deal with this? Second line of defense, minimize the impact of negative information. Here's a very old cartoon, a guy named Andy Capp. He's walking down the street with his wife, and they're really unhappy, you can see. There they are, walking down the street, and the neighbors come out, and they're having this huge fight. And now on the right side, they're both smiling, and she says, nothing cheers you up as much as finding that your neighbors aren't exactly ecstatic either, right? So there are things that we can do. There's a meaning-making process that we can engage in that says, oh, from this raw data, I thought we were miserable, walking down the street, miserable. Oh yeah, I can recast that data and say, I'm nowhere near as miserable as my neighbors, and that's a good thing. Aren't I lucky? So here we try to keep negative events from being registered as negative. And how do we do that? We can be kind of flexible in what our standards are, right? We can say, even in good relationships, people can argue a lot, right? Sometimes people go for extended periods of time in their relationship without a lot of sex. Or, I really like Betty, and even though she does have some issues, by and large, things are going pretty well, right? Even though we argue about certain things, I can be flexible enough. I can rise to the challenge and say, I can still manage this negativity. Even though I acknowledge the negativity, I can manage that and not let it get the best of us. And also, this is a very good thing to do in our relationships, right? And we can also restructure our cognitions by integrating negative and positive features simultaneously. So you can put the negative stuff aside the positive stuff. So if there's negative stuff going on, you say, yeah, that's true, but this is also true. And this is a great thing. We have this shared history. We're just going through a rough place right now, right? Even though my partner does these things, actually a lot to what she's about and what she's achieving. She's a great mom, for example. We might not get along famously all the time, but I really admire what she's able to do, right? So we sort of make not only do we have flexible standards for what we consider to be acceptable within a relationship, what we do is in encountering negativity or a negative bit of information, we contextualize it. We surround it with other bits of positive information that take away some of the negative edge, right? We do this all the time. We derogate our alternatives, which means, I could sort of see being with another person, but look at all the bad things that person does, right? We sort of downplay our options, right? We stay within our relationship. We say, granted, I'm having this issue with my relationship, but guess what? If you get a new partner, it's just a whole new set of issues. There's no perfection. I'm better off sticking here and really trying to make this relationship better. My options may not be that great. We also, and this is most powerful, I think, is that we engage in a sort of cognitive juggling act that allows us to recast negative things as either neutral or positive. We have the ability cognitively to neutralize partner actions. So let me talk about this for a minute, specifically through one historical event, which was when former President Bill Clinton, right there, engaged in let's see, I think I'm allowed to say it was a sexual experience, depending on how you define sexual through the eyes of President Clinton. Some of you may, I know you're too young to remember this, but he denied that he had sexual relationships with that woman. Those were his words. But it did involve a private part of his body and one of her orifices. I don't want to say more than that, but that, for most of us, would get pretty close to a sexual encounter. And it happened, by the way, on a photocopier in the White House next to the Oval Office. That's what the record shows. And what's interesting is not that, though it's pretty interesting. What's interesting is not that our country was roiled politically by this event for months and months and months, but that Hillary Clinton stayed. And she took a lot of flack for this. Here she is in the upper right. She was interviewed in the Los Angeles Times after she appeared, I believe it was on 60 Minutes, a big news show here in the U.S. And she was asked, so why did you stay? Why would you have stayed? And here were some of the things she said. So again, a negative event has happened. Not only do you know it's happened, but everybody in the country knows it's happened. How do you make sense of that? How do you spin that so you say, this is the right thing to do? How do you make sense of that and say, my husband is a cheating philanderer and I'm out of here? How do you do the opposite? Here's what she did. She says, everybody has dysfunction in their families. This is common. You don't walk away from somebody you love. That would be wrong. No one would do that. You help the person, right? That's a reasonable thing to say. She also said, he's a good man. Deep in his heart, he's a good person, right? He's not a bad guy who does bad things. He's a good guy who slipped. We did have a very good stretch of time, years and years of time in which he had no affairs whatsoever. That's proof that he can do it. He can go for long periods of time and actually be monogamous. That's pretty great. I'm going to give him some points for that, right? Because, by the way, he had a lot of affairs when he was governor of Arkansas. And then this story was one of the women's names. Anybody know any names there? Jennifer Flowers was the famous one. And the story was that I don't know if this part's true. I don't want anybody suing me if they're watching this podcast, so I don't know this is true. Allegedly, his protective crew, the state troopers in Arkansas, were the ones who were procuring girls for him. That's a great job, huh? So then Hillary also said, there are sins of weakness and sins of malice. Sins of weakness and sins of malice. And this was a sin of weakness. Why would I create additional suffering and pain for someone I love who did something wrong when it was really not out of malice? He didn't do this to hurt me. It was a weakness. It was a failing of his, a limitation, a flaw. None of us is perfect. I'm going to let Bill off the hook. And these are the strategies, these are the operations that she engaged in to arrive at that conclusion. So that is, those are examples of this attributional process. Data happens. There's lots of different ways to interpret those data. Each one of them has a certain sort of emotional reaction to them, which is, yeah, it was bad that he did this, and I'm pretty angry at him, and yet it would be wrong for me to abandon him. That's one pattern. Hillary did that. Another option would have been to say, yes, he violated one of the agreements that we had, that our marriage was not to be violated in this way. He violated that. I'm incredibly angry at him. I can only be angry at him, and that's all I will ever be, so I'm checking out, right? So data bring with them varied interpretations. Varied interpretations bring with them different emotions. Those emotions bring with them different pathways of action. And this is one. But we have to remember that in all of our relationships, we're making choices. It's hard to believe that that we are making choices. It doesn't feel like a conscious choice. Like if you said to Hillary Clinton, is this a choice you're making? Like, are you actively choosing from among your options? She wouldn't say that. She wouldn't say, yeah, I'm making a choice. She would say, no, this is how I feel. This is how I believe the world to be. And it serves her and her marriage especially well. Now, so first line of defense, keep the negative away. Second line of defense, when you can no longer ignore the fact hold it at bay, like minimize the damage that it causes. But there does come a point where the defenses have to fail, right? There does come a point where you say, okay, I tried and tried and tried. I did all of those things. I tried to use the enhancement bias as much as I could, and yet still things are terribly, terribly wrong within this relationship. So here's a guy who is walking in the door, and he has some flowers there for his wife. It looks like he is intoxicated. She's talking to a neighbor, and she says, he either did something or he forgot to do something, right? So she could say, oh, flowers, isn't I'm the luckiest guy in the luckiest woman to get flowers from my partner. But in this case, now the selective attention focuses away from the positive onto the negative, and he either did something wrong or he forgot to do something that I needed him to do. So even when he tries to, and you've probably been in a relationship like this, you try to then climb your way back out of the hole, right? And you try to make a gesture that you say, actually, it's not as bad as you think, or I didn't do it on purpose, or no, seriously, here's a bunch of flowers, here's some candy, everything's going to be okay, we can work through this. Now the cognitions shift, and they, as impressive as they are as biases that allow us to keep negative information from affecting us, now they are just like lint on a suit, right? There's no way of getting it off you now. And so sometimes the partner's negative actions cannot be ignored away, and you just can't explain them. So relationships change as the biases that once helped us now become a hindrance, okay? So we have this capacity for motivated reasoning that really does protect us in a lot of ways. But there does come a point at which that combination of the cognitions and the behaviors and the emotions, really the dam eventually has to break, right? And so the negative perceptions flood in. We start to attend more and more to our partner's negative actions instead of the positive ones. So now, whereas before we were trying to confirm and look for ways to confirm how good our relationship is and confirm how smart we were to be in a relationship with such a great, good-looking person, now we're confirming the opposite. Now we're confirming things like, oh yeah, I always thought he was a little selfish at first. And now you go and talk to your friends and say, my partner's kind of selfish, don't you think? I mean, aren't you seeing that way? And so we now confirm the opposite, where we were really confirming the positive, we're confirming the negative now. And now we start to remember, it didn't get off so well at the beginning. He was good in bed, but not great. I mean, I could imagine better, seriously. All these negative experiences that you've had now become, even neutral experiences start to really register as negative. Like, yeah, that one time you went to the party with me, you sort of left me there for 2 hours. I got really pissed off. Now those things start to become salient as memories. And we process those perceptions in less adaptive ways, right? We don't let our partner off the hook quite as much. So our perceptions become more rigid. They become more stable. Like, it's no longer a perception for me. This is the reality. You're kind of selfish. There's nothing you can say that's going to change that, right? You are a selfish person. I can deal with your selfishness. It's not about me. I can rise above your limitations, but you cannot convince me that you don't have limitations. And your limitation is you're overly selfish. And if you've ever been in a relationship where your partner has drawn that conclusion, that is a really hard step to get past. Other relationships, whereas before we used to derogate our alternatives, all of a sudden other relationships look kind of good. Like that couple's holding hands, but Betty and I, all we do is squabble. Like, that looks so much better. Like, there must be something better for me out there. And so our alternatives look better. And now our attributions flip. Whereas before we were able to take a negative event and neutralizing it, now we neutralize the positive events. Oh, you gave me flowers? Were they on sale today? So the attributions flip. Negative things become more negative. They register more negatively. and positive things really become minimized. We downplay them. We take away some of the meaning that they once might have, and some of the value, the impact they could have had in strengthening our relationship, maintaining our relationship. So let's stop there, and we will meet up again on Tuesday.